Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the skin of a fruit so controversial, so suspiciously red and squishy, that it once caused panic in the polished parlours and teacup gardens of Victorian England. That's right, tonight we're talking about the humble tomato, not as the juicy pizza topper you know today, but as an object of fear, confusion, and whispered superstition. You're strolling down a cobbled London street in the year 1843. The gas lamps are flickering, your boots tap against damp stone, and there's a slight chill in the evening air that makes your coat feel heavier. The market's winding down, but there's a stall still lit up with strange, vibrant produce. And there, gleaming like little red lanterns, sit the tomatoes, glossy, vibrant, and entirely untouched. You'd think someone set out a tray of decorative poison apples. No one's buying them. In fact, a man just crossed himself while passing. Because back then, people weren't just uninterested in tomatoes. They were absolutely terrified of them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love hearing from sleepy historians around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean closer to the stall. A woman behind the counter gives you a suspicious look, as if you've approached something unholy. Don't touch them, she warns quietly. They're blood fruit, for decoration only. You blink, half amused, half curious. They don't look evil, just very shiny. The tomato, Solanum lycopersicum if you want to be fancy about it, had been around in Europe since the 16th century, imported from the Americas. But while Mediterranean countries like Italy and Spain had already embraced its juicy allure, Victorian Britain was another matter entirely. Here, suspicion lingered like fog over the Thames. One of the leading reasons, death by dinner party. See, upper-class Brits loved their pewter and lead-glazed dishware, perfect for showing off your wealth. Unfortunately, when acidic foods like tomatoes met those materials, a nasty chemical reaction occurred. Lead would leach into the food, and suddenly that colourful salad turned into a silent executioner. Guests would fall ill. Some would even die. But the tomato got the blame. You hear the whispers drifting from a nearby cafe window. A group of gentlemen sipping tea and murmuring about how the crimson globes are clearly unnatural, and no proper Englishman eats those. One of them adds, "They say it causes madness, you know, like absinthe, but in fruit form." You can't help but smirk. Madness by salad. That would explain some of the hats around here. But the fear wasn't all poison and pewter. It was also about optics. Tomatoes looked strange. They were soft when ripe, and their insides were, well, let's be honest, a bit gutsy. Not the tidy firmness of a respectable apple or the innocent crunch of a cucumber. Victorians loved order, symmetry, decorum. Tomatoes, they were unpredictable. One gentle squeeze and it might explode in your hand like a crime scene. And their colour. The very symbol of danger. Red meant fire, blood, sin. A woman walks past you, clutching her child's hand tighter as she glances nervously at the produce stand. "Don't look," she hisses, "that fruit bleeds when cut." Even the name love apple, which some had borrowed from the French pomme d'amour, only added to the scandal. Anything associated with romance and foreign accents was viewed as suspect. The tomato wasn't just unsafe, it was un-British. You continue walking and pass a small apothecary. In the window, herbs are bundled and hung with care, but no tomatoes in sight. Because back then, even doctors raised an eyebrow. The medical community was still shaking off centuries of humours and leeches. And the tomato, believed by some to aggravate bile or even inflame passions, was not considered a friend to the Victorian gut. It's no wonder the average Brit thought this fruit might just sneak into your intestines and start trouble. And yet, not everyone agreed. Some adventurous gardeners were starting to grow them, not to eat, but simply to look at. In the carefully curated gardens of country estates, tomatoes were often planted for their colour, like exotic orchids behind glass. One nobleman, rumoured to be eccentric, allegedly hired a servant whose sole job was to polish the tomatoes daily. He never once ate one. You duck under an iron gate into one of these stately gardens, and there they are, rows of tomatoes in ornate wooden beds, gleaming in the moonlight like tiny forbidden suns. You reach out to touch one. It's warm, almost inviting. But then you hear a voice behind you. Careful, a gardener mutters. People say they have properties. What kind of properties? You ask. He shrugs. Something about what they do to the blood. Can't say more. Just don't eat one raw. It's amazing, really, how a fruit so common in your fridge today once caused panic, superstition, and social ruin. People feared tomatoes like modern folks fear pop-up ads. You don't know what's behind them, but you're sure it isn't good. And the thing is, the story's just getting started, because not long after this night, someone will take a bite, and when they do, everything will change. But for now, the tomato sits quietly in its crate, watched, feared, still misunderstood. Just like you, maybe, wandering through this old city with questions and curiosity, wondering why something so ordinary could once be so feared. Tomorrow, perhaps, you'll taste one, but tonight, you just walk. The next morning, fog still clings to the rooftops like a lazy cat refusing to move. You wake to the sound of distant carriage wheels and the sharp clack of boot heels on stone. Somewhere downstairs, a kettle hisses over a coal fire, and outside your window, birds sing like they haven't a clue that tomatoes are still on trial in polite society. You make your way through the narrow streets again, pulled by a vague curiosity. Your destination? A breakfast invitation from a rather flamboyant gentleman named Lord Barrington. He insists on calling himself a progressive gastronome, which is suspicious in itself. He's known for shocking dinner guests with things like pepper, garlic, and, rumour has it, once even a pineapple. His townhouse sits on a quiet square where gaslights flicker and morning papers land with gentle thuds on polished doorsteps. The butler lets you in with the subtle disdain of a man forced to touch your coat. You follow the faint scent of toast and something sharper, metallic almost. And there it is. The dining table, gleaming with silver and set with linen so white it glows. At the centre, a decorative bowl brimming with fresh tomatoes cut in halves, their seeds glistening like amber. A wedge of one even rests, gasp, atop a slice of toast. Lord Barrington appears beaming. Ah, there you are. Sit, sit. I've taken the liberty of preparing something new. I call it tomato on toast. Revolutionary, isn't it? Sham. You sit cautiously, feeling as though you're about to commit culinary heresy. One of the other guests, a tightly laced clergyman, glares at the tomatoes like they're fragments of a pagan idol. Another woman fans herself nervously. No one touches a bite. And yet Lord Barrington bites into his toast with dramatic flourish. Delicious, he says, with tomato juice trailing ever so slightly down his chin like war paint. Absolutely vibrant. Try it. Go on. You look down. The tomato gleams innocently, but you've heard the stories of noblemen who ate tomatoes on silver plates and promptly keeled over mid-meal. And here you are, knife in hand, staring down a fruit with a reputation for murder. That's where it all started, really. The strange connection between tomatoes and aristocratic death wasn't just superstition. It had a grim, metallic root. In those days, the wealthy favoured pewter and silver for their dishes, utensils, even cookware. It was elegant, yes, but chemically unstable when it met something acidic. Tomatoes with their natural acidity would leach lead from the plates into the food. It didn't take much. A few bites, repeated meals, and slowly, quietly, people began falling ill. They'd complain of stomach pain, headaches, fatigue, symptoms of lead poisoning no one understood back then. Doctors just called it nervous illness or indigestion. But pattern recognition is a powerful thing. People started noticing that those who dared eat tomatoes, particularly on nice silverware, had an unfortunate habit of dying early. The tomato, of course, got the blame. No one suspected the forks and plates. And because this mostly affected the upper classes, the tomato developed an especially scandalous reputation. It wasn't just feared, it was gossiped about. They say Lady Whitmore passed after just 3 bites, someone whispers across the table. 3 bites and a spoonful of relish, another murmurs. I heard it turned her tongue black. You don't know whether to laugh or lean in closer. The tomato became a sort of silent assassin in these tales, slipping into salads, hiding in sauces, waiting for the moment someone clinked a silver spoon against its side. Even newspapers got in on it. Victorian tabloids, always eager for drama, began printing stories with titles like Crimson Fruit Claims Another Aristocrat or Is Your Supper Set to Kill You? Some even published ominous illustrations, tomatoes with vampire fangs, or wrapped in funeral veils. If it weren't so ridiculous, you'd almost be impressed. Meanwhile, the real culprit, lead poisoning, slipped under the radar. Because who wants to admit their expensive tableware is a health hazard? Much easier to blame the squishy red fruit. You glance around Lord Barrington's table. He's using stoneware plates. Smart man. He leans over and says, The secret is avoiding the silver. Learned that from my Italian cousins. They've been eating these things for decades and seem quite lively. You arch an eyebrow. Italians eat tomatoes? Oh yes, he nods, with everything. Even ice cream if you believe the rumours. You smile despite yourself. Across the table the clergyman is still untouched, his fork hovering mid-air like a weapon. The woman beside him has quietly removed her tomato slice and tucked it into a napkin, perhaps to burn it later. But a few brave souls begin to nibble, slowly, cautiously. The revolution, it seems, is underway, 1 bite at a time. Still, you can't help but feel a little thrill. Not fear exactly, but the strange excitement of testing a forbidden thing. You take a small bite. The juice is sweet and tart, the texture soft, yielding. It's fine. Kind of nice, actually. Certainly not deadly. Unless, of course, that was a silver spoon you just used. Just kidding, it was pewter, but still, probably best not to lick it. As the meal winds down, you realise something. Tomatoes didn't just suffer from being misunderstood. They were victims of circumstance, fashion, and a deadly combination of metal and misinformation. A fruit caught in the crossfire of elegance and ignorance. And yet here they are, on toast, on trial, slowly gaining allies. It'll be a long road before the tomato finds peace in the English breakfast. But this morning, at least, it's made a small, squishy step forward. And you survived your first bite. Tomorrow might be a different story. The streets feel different after that breakfast. Brighter, almost. Or maybe it's just the afterglow of surviving your first taste of tomato in Victorian England. You walk with a bit more bounce in your step, like someone who's defied social convention and lived to tell the tale. But not everyone's ready to follow your bold example. As you pass the public square, you notice a crowd gathering near the statue of some forgotten duke. A well-dressed man in a waistcoat stands atop a crate, waving a newspaper with exaggerated flair. "Another victim of the Crimson Menace," he cries, riling up the morning shoppers. "Lady Addington perished after a single slice. We must protect our supper tables." You pause, half curious, half entertained. He's reading from an article in the London Digest, the headline practically screaming, "Dead by tomato?" The crowd murmurs, some shaking their heads solemnly, others clearly just here for the spectacle. It's remarkable how quickly a fruit became a media villain. The Victorian press, never one to let facts get in the way of a juicy headline, had found its perfect scapegoat. Tomatoes were weird, foreign, and vibrantly red. That was all they needed. You edge closer, pretending to examine a flower cart, but mostly eavesdropping. "They say it seeps into the blood," someone whispers. "Turns it thin, like wine gone off." "And your organs," adds another. "Don't get me started on what it does to the kidneys." This would all be hilarious if it weren't so contagious. Fear, after all, spreads faster than facts. One bad dinner party, one poorly washed fork, and suddenly an entire food group gets blacklisted. The tomato became a symbol of culinary danger, more scandalous than snails, more mysterious than mushrooms. You could almost see it, posters in alleyways, red fruit sketched like wanted criminals. Caution: may cause loss of decorum, digestive upset, or Mediterranean behaviour. And so, at many a proper Victorian table, tomatoes were still used, but not eaten. They sat in the centre like polished stones, admired, feared, but never touched. A little like taxidermy, but juicier. One woman you overhear at a tea shop brags about arranging tomatoes in her garden for their pleasing symmetry. When asked whether she'd ever tasted one, she recoils as if you've suggested eating her corset. "It's not that kind of plant," she huffs. "They're decorative, like dahlias, or Frenchmen." You stifle a laugh and sip your tea. But there's a deeper reason this strikes a chord. Tomatoes had become, perhaps more than anything, a class signifier. Poorer families couldn't afford silver or fine dishware, and often used wooden bowls and ceramic plates. Ironically, their tomatoes didn't kill them, but they also didn't talk about them. They just ate them, quietly, humbly. The rich, meanwhile, had the luxury of dying flamboyantly. You wander into a small bookshop near the edge of the square. Inside, dust dances in the golden morning light, and the air smells of ink and paper. A section marked Household Guides and Domestic Concerns catches your eye. There, nestled between volumes about hair tonics and corset hygiene, you find a book titled The Careful Table, Avoiding Poison in the Modern Home. You flip through. There it is, on page 38. Tomato, a decorative but dubious fruit. It warns readers not to consume the fruit unless fully certain of one's crockery. The tone is so polite it's almost a lullaby, if lullabies included tips on not dying from salad. Even cookbooks tiptoe around it. Recipes call for the red fruit or garden pearl, avoiding the word tomato as if it might stain the page. In one recipe for summer stew, it's listed as optional. Use only if you've made peace with the Lord. That night you're invited to a supper hosted by Lady Dunsley, a widow of 4 husbands, all of whom died under mysterious culinary circumstances. Her parlour is perfumed and dimly lit, with lace curtains and oil lamps that make everything feel like a séance. On the table, roast duck, boiled carrots, and a suspiciously red sauce glistening in a crystal dish. You raise an eyebrow. She notices. "Tomato relish," she says, with a wicked little smile. "Imported." You hesitate, but she spoons a dollop onto her plate without flinching. "The trick," she whispers, "is to serve it on bone china. No metals, no deaths." You take a tiny taste, sweet, tangy, slightly spicy, and, most importantly, survivable. Lady Dunsley leans in. Don't tell the vicar. He thinks I'm in league with the Continentals. You wonder briefly how many Victorian cooks were secret tomato fans, quiet rebels in white aprons, hiding sliced tomatoes under lettuces or blending them into sauces nobody could name. Because even back then, culinary revolutions didn't start in the parliament or press. They started in kitchens, one bold bite at a time. And you're now part of it, a reluctant participant in the tomato underground. Tomorrow might bring another whisper of scandal, another funeral blamed on the fruit. But tonight, as the oil lamps flicker and the air smells faintly of nutmeg and rebellion, you finish your plate without fear. You are, after all, a survivor of the Crimson Curse. For now, the next morning greets you with drizzle, a proper British welcome, and the soft rustling of newspapers being delivered door to door, like whispers on parchment. As you step outside, the cobblestones glisten, and your boots find every puddle they possibly can. You don't mind. You've survived tomato toast and a dab of Lady Dunsley's scandalous relish. At this point, you feel nearly invincible, until you hear someone hiss. They've started growing them now. You turn to find a wiry man peeking nervously over his garden wall. He jerks his chin toward a nearby estate where the wrought iron gate stands open just enough to offer a glimpse of neatly kept rows of leafy vines, each one bearing small plump tomatoes like rubies in the mist. "Isn't that illegal?" he mutters. "Not quite," you reply, unsure if he's joking or genuinely afraid. You wouldn't be surprised if someone had tried to pass a Tomato Regulation Act in the House of Commons. Stranger things had happened, like powdered wigs or mustard foot baths. Still, his fear isn't entirely irrational, not in Victorian England, because as tomatoes began to sneak their way into polite gardens, their reputation hadn't softened. If anything, it took a turn towards something more mystical. You make your way through the rain to a village on the outskirts of town, where a small herbalist's shop is rumoured to sell questionable produce. The bell above the door jingles softly, and the smell inside is earthy. Dried lavender, camphor, something vaguely acidic. Behind the counter, an older woman eyes you with curiosity. "You here for willow bark, or something redder?" she asks. Without blinking, you raise an eyebrow. "Depends. Will the red thing ruin my reputation?" She chuckles. "Only if you eat it in front of the bishop." She pulls back a faded curtain to reveal a shelf lined with jars, preserves, pickles, even something labelled Pomodoro Elixir. And on the lowest shelf, nestled in straw like bird eggs, sit half a dozen bright tomatoes. "Beautiful, aren't they?" she murmurs. "People say they're full of sun. Others say they're cursed. I say, delicious in soup." You buy two, for science, of course. As she wraps them in brown paper, she tells you how the tomato was once called the wolf peach, a name that practically howls danger. According to an old folk tale, witches used them to summon visions, or confuse men's hearts, or spoil a rival's harvest. A fruit of chaos and appetite. It makes sense. Victorians loved assigning moral alignment to vegetables. Cabbages were humble and good. Beets were honest but intense. Tomatoes, clearly seducers. She leans in again. They say a woman once fed her husband tomato stew every day for a month, and by the end he'd quit his job, grown his hair long, and started writing poetry. You nod solemnly. A fate worse than death. She grins and hands you the parcel. "Just don't feed it to anyone wearing mourning black. Bad things happen." Outside, you pass a clergyman giving a rather animated sermon on the evils of imported temptation. He's pointing to a crudely drawn poster of a tomato, adorned with horns, of course, under the banner, "Beware the Devil's Fruit." Monsieur, you suppose it's easier to blame the downfall of society on a salad ingredient than, say, industrial child labour or collapsing sewage systems. But despite the hysteria, tomatoes were making quiet advances, in back gardens tucked behind rose bushes, on cutting boards in kitchens too humble to care what the neighbours thought. A war was being fought not with swords but with recipes. One of your acquaintances, a footman with an unusually philosophical streak, mentions that the cook he works under now uses tomatoes in the stew for the meat, but only when no one's looking. The staff love it. The lord of the house thinks the rich flavour comes from imported beef glaze. Deception by flavour. Delicious rebellion. You return home, peel the brown paper from your parcel, and lay the 2 tomatoes on the windowsill. The light hits them just right. They look innocent, inviting even. You slice one open. It doesn't scream. Instead, the scent is earthy, bright, oddly comforting. You eat a piece, then another, still breathing. No fire, no madness. Your skin doesn't turn crimson. Your teeth stay firmly in place. What was all the fuss about? Still deep down, you know the fear was never about the fruit itself. It was about change. Tomatoes were foreign, unfamiliar, unsettling. They arrived with sailors, merchants, and stories of lands far beyond English shores. They brought the scent of the Mediterranean and the whisper of foreign spice, and that, more than any poison or pewter reaction, was what frightened people the most. Because in a world obsessed with class, order, and respectability, a soft red fruit from across the sea had the audacity to be different. And if you could eat that, what else might you dare to try? It's nearly noon when you step into the conservatory of the Radcliffe estate, a soaring glass structure attached to the back of a manor so primly Gothic it seems to scowl at sunlight. Inside, the air is thick with warmth and chlorophyll. Ferns, lilies, vines of every sort spill over polished stone, but you're not here for the orchids. You're here for the tomatoes. They dangle from vines tied neatly to stakes, glowing like rubies beneath the canopy of green. And nearby stands Lady Clarissa Radcliffe, garden shears in hand, dressed in pale blue with a hat so wide it might double as a parasol. "You're just in time," she says without turning. "They're blooming beautifully today, ornamentally, of course." You step closer, pretending to admire the arrangement. Clarissa cuts a tomato clean from the vine and holds it up between 2 gloved fingers like it's a jewel. "I would never eat one, obviously," she adds quickly, as though the very suggestion were scandalous. "But aren't they exquisite? I like them next to the pink roses. It creates contrast." That was the thing with the upper class. Even when tomatoes had stopped being purely terrifying, they were still not edible. They were aesthetic, art pieces, decoration, like a harpsichord no one played or a stuffed peacock in the foyer. Lady Clarissa places the tomato gently in a porcelain bowl beside 3 others. You notice they're arranged by hue, deep red, soft coral, and one verging on golden. Like an artist's palette, not a salad. "I tried using one as a centerpiece for the gala," she confides. "It matched the wallpaper. Of course, someone did try to eat it. Can you imagine?" She fans herself with mild offence. "The gardener's apprentice, I believe. Foreign." The tomatoes were not just exotic. They were becoming a status symbol, albeit a strange one. You owned them to show you had them, to flirt with danger, to display an adventurous spirit without ever actually risking anything. You wander the greenhouse with her, trailing fingers along warm glass and breathing in the scent of soil and chlorophyll. A young maid passes by, glancing sideways at the tomatoes, and you catch the tiniest smirk on her face. You corner her later near the back steps and ask quietly, Do you ever eat them? She snorts. Of course, we fry them, stew them, even slice them cold with vinegar if cook's in a good mood. We just do it downstairs, where the plates are made of clay and nobody's watching. She grins like someone sharing a secret about buried treasure. The rich grow them for their parties. We grow them to live. And there it was. Tomatoes somehow had become a fruit of the people, not by revolution, but by silent persistence. In country cottages and cramped kitchens, tomatoes were being chopped, salted, and savoured with none of the ceremony or superstition that haunted drawing rooms and dinner tables above. In some ways, the class divide ran red and ripe. Later that evening, you find yourself at a dinner hosted by the Marchioness of Kettering. Her house is enormous, her jewellery excessive, and her chef, rumoured to be Italian, has been temporarily dismissed for trying to sneak tomatoes into a soup. The scandal made it all the way to the gossip column. You overhear guests whispering about that dreadful night when the consommé came out pink. One woman clutches her pearls as she says, "My spoon touched it. I haven't been the same since. But you know better." And so does the footman who slips you a wink as he clears the dishes. As the guests retire to the parlour for tea and tense piano playing, you wander toward the kitchen, led by the scent of something rich and savoury. The staff are eating their own meal, laughter echoing in the stone-walled space. On one table, still steaming from the oven, sits a tomato pie, golden crust, red bubbling filling, herbs dancing on top like confetti. They offer you a slice. You don't hesitate. It's divine. Crackling crust, savoury sweet filling, the richness of the tomato mellowed by slow cooking and a pinch of salt. It's not dangerous. It's not scandalous. It's just food. Honest, warm, and quietly revolutionary. One of the cooks chuckles. They don't know what they're missing upstairs. You swallow another bite and nod. They will. Because things were shifting. Not fast, not loudly. But every tomato grown for decoration ended up tempting a gardener. Every scullery maid who tasted a slice passed the recipe to a friend. Every tongue that braved the fruit carried the flavour into another home. It wasn't the dramatic moment of acceptance that stories often promise. No fireworks, no applause. Just quiet forks, scraping quiet plates. And you somewhere in the middle, still wandering, still watching. A guest in both worlds, 1 foot in powdered decorum, 1 foot in stew pots. But your stomach at least knows which side it prefers. It's late afternoon when you find yourself at the edge of a village fair. An event so enthusiastically English, it might as well have been stitched out of bunting and clotted cream. Booths line the green like soldiers in a politely festive army, each offering jam jars, pickled vegetables, or intricately carved soap. Somewhere in the distance, someone is playing a concertina badly. You meander past a tent labelled Horticultural Curiosities, drawn in by the promise of something odd. And there it is again. The tomato. But not just one. Dozens. They're arranged in tidy rows like obedient soldiers, each variety labelled in careful cursive. Oxheart, Brandywine, Yellow Pear, Mr. Fortescue's Crimson Marvel. You lean in. One has stripes, another looks like a tiny lantern. One is so deeply purple it almost glows. Behind the table stands a gentleman with a moustache large enough to qualify for its own voting district. He beams at you. "Beautiful, aren't they?" he says. "Don't worry, we're not eating them, just admiring." Of course. You stroll down the row as he continues to explain, loudly, proudly, that these specimens were grown in a greenhouse without metal tools. No contamination, he assures a sceptical elderly woman who leans in to sniff a tomato like it might bite. And yet, something in the air has shifted. There's less fear here, more fascination. The tomatoes are no longer just forbidden. They're curious, novel, even stylish, like a new kind of hat everyone's too afraid to wear but desperate to comment on. You overhear someone whisper, "The Duchess herself grows the yellow ones now, in pots." Scandalous. And so the tomato begins to morph, from deadly to decorative to fashionable. The transformation isn't complete, of course. Some still insist it's madness to so much as slice one. But others are starting to lean in. That's how it always starts. You pass a booth offering vegetable portraiture, and there on a small canvas is a still life, a tomato sliced open beside a hunk of cheese and a loaf of bread, painted with all the reverence of a cathedral. It's titled A Quiet Rebellion. Subtle, clever, possibly treasonous. Further down you spot a cluster of men arguing over something near the cider stall. One insists that tomatoes were never meant for English soil. Another claims to have eaten one fried, with salt and a dab of beef drippings, and says he didn't just survive, he enjoyed it. Enjoyment, the first man scoffs. That's how it starts. You smile and keep walking. Near the edge of the fair, there's a small makeshift stage, and a woman in a patched apron is reciting rhyming couplets. You pause just as she begins, "O tomato, red and round, why do you frighten genteel ground? You danced from shores beyond the sea to cause digestive mutiny." The crowd laughs. Not mockingly, fondly, like the fear is something they remember, not something they still carry. You buy a small basket of heirloom tomatoes from a boy whose knees are grass-stained and whose fingers are red from handling his goods. "You gonna eat 'em?" he asks skeptically. You nod. "And maybe write a poem?" He snorts. "We had 'em roasted last week. Bit of salt, bit of pepper. You'd never go back." And that's the secret, isn't it? Once you've tasted it, once you've realized it doesn't kill you, it becomes a part of you. The fear fades, the flavor remains. Later, as you sit beneath an oak tree with the basket beside you, you realize how silly it all was. That something so simple, so soft and sun-warmed, could have been cast as villainous. But people fear what they don't understand. And in a world that prized cold cutlery and colder manners, the tomato was too much, too foreign, too red, too juicy, too alive. You bite into one right then and there, the juice trickling down your chin. It tastes of earth and light and quiet defiance. And for a moment the fairgrounds blur in the late day sun, and you feel as though you're part of something. Ripening. Not a revolution. Not yet. But something close. As twilight slides gently over the rooftops like a velvet shawl, you find yourself wandering the quieter streets of town, following the sound of hushed voices and clinking glasses. You weren't planning to visit a tavern tonight, but here you are, being drawn in by the hum of conversation and a chalkboard that reads, "Special stew tonight, no questions asked." Inside the place smells of firewood, damp coats, and secrets. Candles flicker on scarred wooden tables. The crowd is mostly labourers, delivery boys, laundresses, folk too tired for theatre, but not tired enough for bed. You sit near the hearth, and before you even ask, the barkeep sets down a bowl of something steaming and rich. He doesn't explain it. He doesn't need to. You recognise that scent now. Tomato. You glance around half expecting a moral riot to erupt, but nobody seems to care. They're eating. Slurping, even. The world didn't end. The Queen didn't burst in with a sword. The soup is thick, red gold in the firelight, spiced just enough to make your tongue curious. You're halfway through your bowl when a man in a worn cap leans over and says, "First time." You nod. "Good, innit?" He grins. "Cook's sister brought back seeds from France. started growing them behind the coal shed. Says they're a bit witchy, but she boils the wickedness out. You can't help but chuckle. That simple, huh? Most things are, he shrugs, sipping his own stew. It's just the gentry that like to make it complicated. That's when it strikes you. This whole saga isn't really about tomatoes. It's about fear wrapped in etiquette, suspicion folded into a napkin. The fruit just happened to be different, and in a world where difference was often punished with ridicule, that was enough to start a whisper campaign. You finish your stew and tip the barkeep generously. Outside, the air is cool and sharp, the kind that makes your lungs stretch and your thoughts clear. You walk past shuttered storefronts and flickering gas lights, thinking about how far the tomato has come in just a few years, and how far it still has to go. A horse-drawn carriage rattles by. Inside, a lady in velvet holds a lace fan over her face. Her driver's cap bears the crest of a house known for its impeccable taste and total culinary cowardice. You wonder if she's ever had tomato stew. Probably not. But maybe one day. Because things were shifting in ways too slow to measure day by day, but unmistakable over time. The fear was starting to fray. The borders of the palate, once so carefully fenced, had begun to blur. And every bite taken in back kitchens and low taverns carved a little crack in the wall. You pause at the edge of a garden behind a row of terrace houses. There, in the glow of a single oil lamp, a child and her grandmother are kneeling in the soil. They're tending to something with soft leaves and climbing stems. You already know what it is. The grandmother glances up, catches your eye and smiles. They'll be right by St. Swithin's Day, she says. Plenty for the whole street if we get the sun. You smile back and nod. Then you keep walking, basket under your arm, coat buttoned tight, and something in your chest just a little warmer. Because you know now without question that the tide is turning. And even if the tomato doesn't make it to every drawing room just yet, it's winning. Quietly, softly, one kitchen at a time. You're up early the next morning, drawn not by sunlight or birdsong, but by curiosity. Specifically, the curiosity of seeing what a Victorian doctor thinks of tomatoes. You've arranged a visit to Dr. Lionel Thistlecroft, a physician of some repute, known for his rigid views on digestion, bathing, and the dangers of damp socks. His office occupies the lower floor of a narrow brick building wedged between a milliner and a cellar of dubious tonics. A brass plaque reads, Dr. L. Thistlecroft, M.D., Disorders of the Stomach and Morals. Promising. The door creaks open with a shudder, and you step into a room that smells faintly of cloves, dust, and overconfidence. The doctor appears in a brown suit so stiff it may be medically reinforced. He gestures to a chair beside a glass cabinet filled with dried herbs and little skulls, some human, some speculative. Tell me, he begins, steepling his fingers, have you perchance consumed any fruit of the nightshade family in the past week? You admit you've had a bit of tomato, he gasps. Good heavens, you seem perfectly upright, no signs of fever nor delirium. Remarkable. You assure him it was cooked? Ah, well, he says, visibly relaxing. Cooking neutralizes some of the more treacherous qualities. You see, the tomato, while not formally poisonous, does bear suspicious resemblance to other solanaceous entities. He walks to his bookshelf and pulls out a hefty tome titled Maladies of the Modern Stomach, opens to a hand-coloured diagram and points. This, he declares, is a belladonna berry. This is a tomato. Spot the difference. You squint. One is deadly, the other is delicious. But they do share a certain family resemblance. Shiny skin, plump shape, the unsettling promise of the unknown. Many in my field, he continues, suspect that long-term consumption of tomatoes may lead to undue emotional fervour, moist palms, or a tendency toward Mediterranean disposition. We are not yet sure if these effects are reversible. You nod solemnly. Sounds dangerous. Quite. He produces a tiny jar from his desk drawer and hands it to you. Dried tomato skin. For study. I recommend you keep it sealed. For safety. You tuck it away like a cursed talisman. What's fascinating is not that doctors feared tomatoes. It's that they feared what they represented. The Victorian ideal body was cool, dry, and controlled. Tomatoes, by contrast, were warm, moist, and, well, exciting. They whispered of blood and fire and olive oil, things that made one's constitution twitchy. You ask if he's ever tried one himself. He stiffens. Once, in a stew. My dreams were unusually vivid for 3 nights. Basically. You don't press. As you leave his office, the air outside feels fresher. You stop by a bakery to clear your palate. Something simple, like a currant bun or a scone. But right there in the corner of the window sits something new. Savoury tart with tomato and cheese. You do a double take. It's modest. Golden crust, a few rings of roasted tomato, and a sprinkle of something green. But there it is, bold as brass in broad daylight. Not hidden, not whispered, advertised. You step inside. The baker, a cheerful woman with flour on her sleeves, offers you a slice on a square of brown paper. They sell quick, she says, especially to the younger ones. Students mostly. They say it's very European. You take a bite, warm, buttery, rich. The tomato is tender and sweet, with a slight tang that lingers on your tongue like a rumour. It's not just tasty, it's confident. Used to bake 'em without the tomato, she adds. Then a boy from Florence came by and asked why I left the best part out, so I gave it a go. You glance around, a few customers sit by the window, calmly eating tarts, sipping tea, no riots, no moral collapse, just quiet chewing. Even the postman walks by, pauses, then points. You've got more of those tomato things then? She nods. Only 2 left. But I'm such it. You watch him bite into one as he walks off into the street, letters tucked under one arm, pastry in the other. And just like that, another crack in the wall. You think back to Dr. Thistlecroft, his charts, his warnings, his dried tomato specimen in a jar like a fossilized sin. And yet here, 2 blocks away, tomatoes are being baked into tarts and sold by the dozen. History doesn't always shift with trumpets and parades. Sometimes it changes with pastry. You're sitting on a park bench now, the crust of your tomato tart still flaking sweetly on your fingers, when a boy no older than 10 walks by with a satchel full of newspapers. He's shouting the headlines with all the gravitas of a town crier performing Hamlet. New disease hits butchers on Baker Street, he calls. Steamship stuck in Thames mud again. And then, tomatoes may cause melancholia, claims surgeon. You blink. There it is. Again. The boy notices your attention and detours towards you. Extra halfpenny if you want the medical insert, he offers slyly. You pay him the halfpenny and take the crinkling sheet from his ink-stained fingers. And there it is, centre column, wedged between an advert for iron corsets and an opinion piece on the dangers of unaccompanied piano playing. An excess of tomato may weaken the nerves, warns Dr. Horatio Bletheridge, esteemed contributor to the Gastric Almanac. Long associated with foreign tempers and digestive disruption, the tomato, particularly when consumed with vinegar or under conditions of stress, may provoke feelings of introspection, artistic yearning, and overall lassitude. We must not mistake flavour for virtue. You stare at the line for a long moment. artistic yearning. Imagine the horror. Someone might compose a poem after dinner. But it's not just fear anymore. It's shifting towards something softer, skepticism. That vague fog of doubt Victorian society excels at maintaining, even as evidence mounts against it. You wander into the reading room of a modest gentleman's club, one of those places where men pretend to be interested in chess while silently judging each other's trousers. There, over tea and low murmurs, tomatoes have become a subject of careful debate. One gentleman declares, "I had a tomato preserve on toast this morning. I didn't like it, but I'm still here." Another says, "My sister's cook puts them in the gravy now. Adds colour, bit too vivid if you ask me." Then a third, older man, leans forward and whispers like a spy disclosing state secrets. "I had tomato soup last week, voluntarily." There's a moment of silence, then a slow, scandalized inhale. "And?" Someone dares. He shrugs. "Warm, pleasant, could use more salt." It's the most excitement they've had all week. Outside, a milk cart clatters by and you notice a new poster in the grocer's window. "Imported tomatoes, for decorative use or sauce." Or sauce. Two little words that say so much. No apology, no fanfare. Just a quiet admission that maybe, just maybe, people are eating them now. You duck into the shop. The grocer eyes you warily, then gestures to a basket behind the onions. Tomatoes not hidden, but not exactly front and centre either. Like a cousin at a family reunion who isn't quite trusted with the cutlery. "Got them in last Thursday," he mutters. 2 crates already gone. "To cooks?" you ask. He leans in. "To ladies, young ones, fancy ones. Say they saw a recipe in a French magazine." And suddenly you realize where the true agents of tomato revolution are gathering. Kitchens. Not the public dining halls or gentlemen's clubs, but the warm, secretive domains of cooks and housemaids and experimental aunts. People who actually touch food. Because the tomato doesn't need to win debates or survive medical pamphlets. It just needs to be delicious, quietly, repeatedly, in the mouths of the curious. That evening you're invited to dine at a small townhouse on Bell Street, hosted by a widow named Mrs. Marsh, who has taken to inviting odd minds to her table once a fortnight. The room is cosy, filled with oil lamps, patterned curtains, and the smell of roasted garlic. There's a salad course. You pause. The salad is green and simple, but nestled between the lettuce leaves are unmistakable slices of tomato. Glossy, thin, intentionally placed. You glance up. She catches your eye. "They're from my cousin in Devon," she says lightly. "He grows them under glass, entirely for eating." You take a bite, cool, tart, perfect against the olive oil and cracked pepper. "Don't worry," she adds with a grin. "I've written my will." The table laughs. You laugh. You're all in on the joke now. And isn't that how most change happens? Not by force or speech, but by shared glances over dinner plates, by private courage, by chewing slowly while others watch, and not dying afterward. You realize as dessert is served, no tomatoes this time, just pears soaked in port, that something has shifted, not officially, not in law, but socially, culturally, secretly. Tomatoes are no longer if, they are when. And you somehow have become part of that answer. By the end of the week, it seems the tomato is cropping up everywhere, like a polite little rebellion dressed in red. You begin to notice them not just in shops and kitchens, but in conversation, where they now appear less as a punchline and more as a possibility. Even the language is changing. At the booksellers, a woman asks for that new French cookbook, the one with the tomato tarts on the cover. The clerk, scandalized but efficient, produces it without comment. At a tailor's, a gentleman describes a new waistcoat as tomato red. It's a compliment. And at a cafe table near the museum, two young women are arguing, quietly, passionately, about whether tomatoes are best fresh or roasted until they collapse into themselves like weary duchesses. You smile, sipping your tea. Then you overhear something that stops you. "I heard," says one of the women, "that some think it's not a vegetable at all, but a fruit." The other gasps. You lean in slightly. Here we go. Because as the tomato's danger fades, a new confusion rises: classification. The Victorian obsession with naming things properly, compartmentalizing nature into neat Latin drawers, wasn't going to let this crimson anomaly go unchallenged. If it was to be eaten, then it had to be understood, categorized, filed. So you begin to investigate. At the Natural History Society meeting that evening, a dusty affair held in the back room of a lending library. You find yourself sitting beside Professor Alvin Weatherby, a man who once wrote a 14-page paper on why cabbages are emotionally neutral. You ask him about the tomato. He puffs up like a startled partridge. "It's a fruit, obviously," he declares. "Contains seeds, grows from a flower. It is botanically incontestable. And yet," you say gently, "it's served with meats and soups, not in trifles." "Ah," he barks, delighted. "Culinary fruit, botanical vegetable. The duality of the tomato is what makes it so dangerous. It blurs lines. Victorians hate blurred lines." You later discover that this very debate, fruit or vegetable, has appeared in pamphlets, etiquette guides, and even tax documents. One grocer you speak to swears that the classification determines his import duties. "It's a fruit when I buy it," he grumbles, "but a vegetable when I sell it. Typical." But even amid the confusion, there's progress. You visit a market stall run by a woman named Mrs. Penfold, known for her robust onions and no-nonsense attitude. She's begun stocking tomatoes, bright ones, striped ones, even a few with ruffled skins like crumpled velvet. "They're selling faster than plums," she tells you, "and no one's fainted yet." She hands you a recipe card, handwritten in careful script. Mrs. Penfold's tomato and barley soup. You thank her and tuck it into your pocket like a secret spell. It's becoming clear. The tomato shift isn't just about acceptance, it's about domestication. People are learning to live with it, cook with it, joke about it. Children dare each other to bite into them raw. Some even enjoy it. Servants swap seeds. Even skeptical doctors have begun prescribing tomato water for melancholy when served chilled. The next evening you're invited to a garden supper, one of those warm, late summer gatherings where the breeze smells like rose petals and overly watered gin. The host, a woman of considerable social standing, greets you in an embroidered gown and a knowing smile. "We've done something daring," she whispers as you take your seat. "We've included tomato in the menu, 3 courses. The guests murmur with anticipation. The starter is a delicate tomato consommé. The main, lamb and tomato sauce. Dessert is a tomato jam tart. Not too sweet, not too strange. Each course earns a quiet pause, a curious bite, then the slow, almost bashful nod of approval. One man beside you mutters, "I never thought I'd say this, but I rather like the texture." Another says, "It's terribly continental. I feel like I'm on holiday." You don't say anything. You just watch the red ripple through the crowd. A colour that once meant danger now means flavour, warmth, comfort. And then, between bites, someone asks, "Does anyone remember why we were afraid of them in the first place?" A silence. Shrugs, no one can quite recall. You smile and sip your wine, the answer resting on your tongue like the ghost of a joke no longer needed, because that's how it happens. Fear fades not in a rush, but in a ripple, until one day something once feared becomes so common, people forget why it was scandalous at all, and the tomato, once accused of madness, poison, and seduction, is now just part of dinner. The next few days pass like the slow ripening of fruit on the vine. The weather holds in that warm golden lull between seasons, and with it you notice more signs, quiet ones, that the tomato is no longer hiding in the shadows of English cuisine. You pass a schoolyard where children are drawing with chalk on slate boards. One girl is sketching a tomato, carefully shading its roundness, then labelling it, "Red fruit, grows in the sun." Some people are still afraid of it. At least she's honest. You continue on and find yourself near the Royal Botanic Gardens, where the public is invited to observe specimens from the Empire and beyond. There's a small display, mostly ignored, featuring tomato plants in various stages of growth. A little sign reads, Solanum lycopersicum, edible in some cultures. Next to it someone has scribbled in pencil, also edible here, just try it. You laugh quietly. Even the botanists are losing their grip. Inside one of the greenhouses, a young horticulturist is giving a demonstration to a group of curious ladies. He's describing how to grow tomatoes under glass, how to support the stems with string, and how the flowers must be coaxed gently, like shy debutantes. One woman raises her hand. "But what does it taste like?" He pauses, smiles. "You'll have to try it and decide for yourself." Afterward you speak with him. "My father still won't eat them," he admits. "He thinks they inflame the gallbladder. But I started growing them anyway, just to see. Now I can't imagine the garden without them." That's the curious thing. People who begin with doubt often become the fiercest defenders. There's something about discovering the truth yourself, about peeling away years of suspicion and finding nothing underneath but juice and sunlight. You attend a supper later that week at the home of a playwright, known for his slightly indecent comedies, and his fondness for wine that tastes faintly of regret. The meal is loud, messy, wonderful, and smack in the centre of the table is a dish labelled simply Spaghetti al pomodoro. You stare, there it is, not disguised, not renamed, not hidden under sprigs of parsley. A mound of pasta gleaming in red sauce, unapologetic and rich smelling. There's garlic, basil, and the faintest suggestion of rebellion. "Imported recipe," the playwright says cheerfully. "Found it in a Neapolitan novel. Couldn't understand a word of it, but the food descriptions were excellent. People serve themselves. No one hesitates, not even the lady who once claimed tomatoes made her dizzy in the soul. The room fills with the clink of forks and the occasional delighted noise that polite society would frown upon. "This," someone says through a mouthful, "is what dinner should always be." The playwright grins. That's what the Italians keep saying. The evening stretches on in candlelight and the warm haze of wine. And somewhere between the second and third course, someone proposes a toast. Not to tomatoes directly, but to experiments that don't end in disaster. Everyone lifts their glasses. Later in the hallway where coats are collected and secrets are whispered, you overhear two guests discussing the sauce. "I suppose we've always feared new things," one admits. "Remember when people thought trains would melt your organs? Or that novels made women hysterical," the other replies. "And now we have both. And tomatoes." You step out into the street with a full belly and the lingering taste of sauce on your tongue. The night air is cool, but not unfriendly. Somewhere nearby, a window is open and you catch the smell of roasting. Could it be? Tomatoes again. They're everywhere now. Quietly, insistently, deliciously invading. It's no longer a revolution. it's a welcome. Back at your lodgings, you find a small envelope slipped under your door. Inside is a note written in quick, confident script. We're organising a gathering. Gardeners, cooks, curious minds. Tomato tasting, no judgment. Saturday at dusk. You're invited. There's no signature, just a location. You set the note at your table beside your growing pile of recipes, seed packets, and half-finished journal entries. The tomato, it seems, is building a community. And you perhaps are part of its strange, juicy story. Saturday arrives with a sky the colour of old pewter and just enough wind to make your coat flap dramatically as you walk. The note's address leads you down a quiet lane lined with ivy-covered walls and iron gates that creak open with the hesitant groan of secrets. You arrive at what appears to be an overgrown manor garden, now repurposed into something between a potluck and a botanical salon. There are lanterns strung between apple trees, tables made of barrels and mismatched wood, and about 24 people milling about. Some in aprons, some in evening coats, one in a velvet robe you suspect was chosen purely for flair. And tomatoes. They're everywhere, in baskets, on platters, sliced and whole, roasted and raw, skewered, stuffed, stewed. Red ones, yellow ones the size of marbles, others heavy as tea kettles. A quiet joy vibrates through the crowd like a plucked harp string. No one's shouting, no one's trying to convince anyone. They're just tasting, talking, sharing. A woman in her 60s with soot on her sleeves hands you a slice of tomato pie and nods solemnly. Made this from my great-uncle's recipe. He called it fire fruit tart, swore it cured his gout, and brought him 2 marriage proposals. You take a bite, it's buttery, herb-flecked, absurdly comforting. Next, a young man with ink-stained fingers offers you a spoonful of something chilled and deep crimson. Tomato sorbet, he says, eyes wide. It's either genius or treason. It's odd. Sweet and savoury, cold and warm somehow, but bold. And that's the thread running through the entire event. This isn't just about food, it's about permission. To taste, to wonder, to decide for yourself. You chat with a woman who teaches botany and confesses she's planted tomatoes in her classroom window box. For the children, she says, but also for the faculty, if I'm being honest. You recognise faces from all over town. The baker who first sold tomato tarts. The herbalist who once warned you against feeding tomatoes to anyone in mourning. Even a certain footman who claims he's mastered tomato risotto and is this close to sneaking it into his employer's dinner menu. In one corner, someone has pinned up clippings. Newspaper articles, scientific diagrams, cartoon sketches of tomatoes wearing top hats. One is titled, "The Red Menace No More." Another, "Lady Swansbridge admits tomato use in soup, society still standing." There's laughter, the kind that curls at the edges of former fears. You're handed a small ceramic cup filled with a simple broth, tomato, onion, basil, a little oil, nothing fancy. The woman who made it says, "This is what we serve to the hesitant. Just a sip." You take one. It's not bold, not strange, just right, like something your stomach had been waiting for without realizing it. As dusk begins to settle in, the lanterns cast warm golden pools of light, and someone begins to play a cello, low and gentle. You sit on a bench beside a gardener who's eating a slice of tomato on rye with a kind of religious focus. "We used to plant them in the back," he says quietly, "behind the beans where no one could see. Now I've got 6 rows by the front gate." You nod. He glances at you. "Funny how we feared them, isn't it? Like they were going to storm the dining room and demand rights. And maybe, in their way, they did. But they didn't shout or protest. They simply waited, in gardens, on windowsills, in the quiet confidence of flavour, until someone brave enough took a bite. and then another. As the evening deepens, someone proposes a toast, not with wine, but with a chilled tomato, cordial spiked lightly with herbs and citrus. To the misunderstood, they say, to the quietly delicious, to the fruit that dared to be savoury. You raise your glass, it clinks gently against the others. The stars begin to appear, slow and cautious, like guests unsure if they're late. And beneath them, in a tucked-away garden full of laughter and soup and seeds in pockets, the tomato has found its place, not as a novelty, not as a danger, but as something more intimate, a belonging. The next morning you wake to soft sunlight spilling across your floor like warm cream. The windows are slightly ajar, letting in the scent of something green and fresh, cut grass, damp earth, and perhaps, if you're not imagining it, the faint tang of tomato leaves crushed between fingers. Your breakfast is simple, a slice of bread, a smear of butter, and without hesitation now, a few rounds of tomato layered on top with a pinch of salt. It feels like nothing, but also like everything. Later, as you stroll through town, you notice something peculiar. A kind of quiet tipping point has been reached. The tomato has moved beyond curiosity. It's begun to settle in, to stay. At the bookseller's window, there's now a full shelf devoted to continental cooking. Tomato dishes dominate the covers: bakes, sauces, stews. One book features a tomato painted to look like a noblewoman wearing a little crown of herbs. At the post office, someone has pinned a recipe to the community board. Mrs. Featherly's tomato chutney, now with less risk. Even the street vendors have changed their offerings. Where once there were only meat pies and sugared buns, now a boy with a wheelbarrow is selling paper-wrapped tomato sandwiches. He waves as you pass. 3 for a penny, and no one's died yet. At mid-morning you make your way to the Royal Society of Culinary Refinement, a group known mostly for arguing about whether white pepper is morally superior to black. They're hosting a lecture titled From Suspicion to Supper, The Curious Journey of the Tomato. The speaker is a nervous-looking man in pince-nez and a cravat too tight for comfort. But his voice, though halting, carries conviction. We once believed the tomato to be a dangerous intruder, he begins, a trickster fruit, red with mischief. But what we failed to grasp was that the fault was not in the tomato, but in us. A murmur ripples through the audience. We feared its softness, its foreignness, its flavour, because it did not fit neatly into our boxes. Was it fruit, vegetable, decorative, medicinal? We could not decide, so we decided instead to fear. You glance around, heads are nodding. But what have we found instead? He continues. A thing of versatility, of brightness, of unexpected comfort, and might I say, of culinary delight. Applause breaks out, not thunderous, but sincere. After the talk there's a tasting, tiny samples on dainty plates, tomato jam, tomato aspic, tomato and beef pie, even a tomato custard tart that receives mixed reactions but no accusations of witchcraft. Progress. You linger by the tomato aspic, which tastes like Victorian innovation trying to impress a picnic. A woman beside you whispers, I remember when my aunt called tomatoes the devil's plum. Now she grows them by the dozen, and calls them her red darlings. You ask what changed. She did, the woman says, or maybe she just got tired of being afraid of her salad. By afternoon the streets are bustling. At a small cafe, a chalkboard menu reads, Today's soup, tomato, we're not sorry. You order a bowl. It arrives with a thick slice of bread and a quiet confidence. The soup is smooth, deep, just a little spicy, The kind of dish that doesn't demand your attention but somehow earns it anyway. You finish it slowly, letting each spoonful feel like a quiet affirmation. As you eat, you overhear a nearby conversation. A young man is trying to explain to his skeptical uncle why tomatoes are perfectly reasonable now. The uncle counters that the skin is suspiciously shiny. The young man responds, "So is your head, and I still trust your opinions." They both laugh. They finish their sandwiches. One of them has tomato. You step back out into the late afternoon and notice for the first time a tomato plant growing in a pot on someone's front step. Small green fruit still maturing in the sun. No hiding, no apologies. You pause a moment longer, because this quiet, persistent presence is the true victory. Not loud acceptance, not dramatic speeches, just being there, being normal, being part of things. And somehow you feel a little prouder for having noticed it, for having been present at the turning of a page so few thought would ever flip. The tomato is no longer knocking at the door. It's inside, sitting at the table, and tomorrow someone will ask if you'd like seconds. By now you no longer flinch when you see tomatoes in public. They're in salads at respectable luncheons. They're simmering on stovetops behind half-open kitchen doors. They're even creeping onto the menus of the more conservative supper clubs, listed with cautious phrasing like red vegetable accompaniment or continental sauce mild, as if to ease the aristocracy into the realization that they've been enjoying tomatoes under assumed names. You're invited one evening to the home of Colonel and Mrs. Weatherstone, known primarily for their rigid dinner etiquette and violent aversion to anything French. You brace yourself for a long evening of dry beef and drier conversation. But to your astonishment, the first course arrives with a subtle, warm scent. There, arranged in a small terracotta bowl, is a roasted tomato, drizzled with olive oil, crowned with a single sprig of rosemary. No explanation, no apology, just served. Across the table, the Colonel says nothing at first. He stares at the tomato as if it might bite him. Then slowly he picks up his fork, pierces the softened flesh, and brings it to his mouth. Chews, swallows, nods, and says, "Well, that's not half bad. So..." That's it. No thunderclap, no gasps, just a quiet acceptance. And somehow it feels like watching a dam crumble, not all at once, but in steady, irreversible cracks. Later, as the main course is served, beef with a tomato glaze. Mrs. Weatherstone leans over and whispers, "Our niece married an Italian. We've been experimenting." You nod with deep understanding, because this is happening all over now. Not just in eccentric households or bohemian circles, but in drawing rooms, garden parties, even church picnics. You attend one such picnic the following Sunday. Between sponge cake and cucumber sandwiches, someone unveils a tomato and onion galette. It vanishes within minutes. No one chokes. No one bursts into flames. A vicar even goes back for seconds. But perhaps the clearest sign of all comes from the language itself. At a printer's shop, you stumble upon a stack of handbills advertising the Tomato Festival. Held at a modest public park, it promises music, tastings, gardening demonstrations, and, for the bold, a poetry corner where guests may read odes to their favourite fruits. The shopkeeper rolls his eyes. "Bit much, isn't it?" You smile. "Or just enough." You attend the festival naturally. It's modest but vibrant. Tables covered with checked cloths, baskets overflowing with heirlooms in every shape and colour. A trio plays a cheerful tune near the lemonade stall, and children run past with tomato-themed ribbons tied in their hair. You sample dishes that range from classic to questionable. Tomato cake, not bad. tomato jelly, an acquired taste, and something called spiced tomato fudge, best left unnamed. At the poetry corner, a teenage boy recites a dramatic sonnet titled, "O Fruit of Flame and Fear." It ends with, "You once were blamed, now bless my plate, from whispered curse to flavour great. You taught us fear was oft untrue, and made my soup a brighter hue." Applause breaks out. Not polite applause, actual applause. You step back from the crowd for a moment, standing near a vendor who's selling seedlings in paper cups. "You remember," he says to no one in particular, "when we had to hide these behind the parsley?" You do. And now here they are, seeds passed from hand to hand, tiny promises of next season's harvest. As the festival draws to a close, you walk past a chalkboard where people have scribbled their tomato first times. First slice in 42, thought I'd go mad, didn't. Had one in a sandwich by accident, now I eat 3 a week. Used to call them devil's fruit. Now I grow 12 vines and named one Gerald. You grin. Because it's all there. Resistance, curiosity, transformation. A story not just of a fruit, but of people. How they change. Slowly, strangely, beautifully. And now, here you are. One of them. You pluck a final tomato from a woven basket on your way out. It's warm from the sun, smooth in your palm, and entirely unremarkable, which, after all this time, might be the most remarkable thing of all. You return home that evening with dirt on your shoes, a tomato in your coat pocket, and the lingering scent of rosemary and roasted garlic clinging to your sleeves. There's a comfort to it now, a kind of humble victory that smells like supper and progress. You place the tomato on the windowsill, where it sits beside a row of others, all in various stages of ripeness. You didn't plan to collect them, but somehow they've become little trophies, each one a reminder of a moment you thought the world might stay the same, until it didn't. The next morning, as the fog drifts lazily across the rooftops, you're invited to a small lecture at a finishing school. Not the sort of place where culinary revolution is typically discussed. But the headmistress, stern and composed, believes the girls ought to understand the evolving landscape of domestic presentation. The girls, all in matching uniforms with expressions that range from polite interest to open boredom, are seated neatly in rows as a guest speaker begins. A woman named Miss Agatha Bell, author of The Modern Lady's Table. She launches into a speech about seasonal arrangements, table symmetry, and then, softly, cautiously, mentions tomatoes. "There is a time," she says, adjusting her gloves, "when the very presence of one on a luncheon table could send a lady to her fainting couch." A few of the girls giggle. "But now," she continues, "they are considered by some a symbol of freshness, of cosmopolitan elegance. One must, of course, exercise restraint, but no longer fear." She pauses as though expecting thunder, or at least a protest. There is none. Afterward, one of the younger students raises her hand. "Miss Bell, may we learn to cook with them?" A few heads turn sharply. The headmistress blinks. Miss Bell, bless her, smiles. "Indeed," she says. "You may learn to do anything with them. That is rather the point." And there it is again. The shift. Small but firm. From caution to curiosity. That evening you dine at the home of a friend who prides himself on hosting experimental meals. You expect olives and olives masquerading as other things. But tonight the theme is refreshingly simple. He calls it the red dinner. Tomato bread, tomato salad, roasted tomatoes with herbs, tomato sauce over rice, even tomato wine, though it tastes admittedly like vinegar with ambition. Everyone at the table is from a different walk of life. A printer, a widow, a teacher, a footman, even a retired sea captain who claims he first ate tomatoes in Portugal after a near-death experience involving goats. No one questions it. You all eat, you talk, You laugh, no one faints, no one argues classification. The tomato is no longer the subject of conversation, it's just part of it. After dinner, your host walks you out and says, "Funny, isn't it? A few years ago, I wouldn't even touch one of those things. Now I grow them in the conservatory and serve them to bishops." You ask him what changed his mind. "I suppose, Maham," he says, "I stopped asking whether they were dangerous and started asking if they were good." You nod. And as you walk home beneath the early stars, you realize something else. The tomato didn't win by force. It didn't storm Parliament or hire a publicist. It simply waited, grew, offered its flavour again and again until enough people took the risk of tasting. You pass a couple on a bench sharing something wrapped in brown paper. You hear the unmistakable crunch of a bite, and then the man says, "It's not bad, a little acidic." The woman replies, "You're a little acidic." They both laugh. Further along, you see a small grocer locking up. On his door, a hand-painted sign. Fresh tomatoes, locally loved. Locally loved. From devil fruit to dinner, darling, from scandal to salad. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow it may be served without anyone mentioning it at all, which is perhaps the highest honour. It's nearing the end of the season now. The days are shorter, the sun hangs lower in the sky, throwing longer shadows across the cobbled streets and stone steps. You find yourself walking slower, as if savouring each breeze, each faded bloom, each rustle of leaves. And yes, each tomato. At the corner greengrocers, the baskets are no longer piled high. The selection is smaller now. A few bruised specimens, one or two still clinging to their vines like they're not quite ready to go. But no one's afraid of them anymore. A child picks one up without hesitation. His mother doesn't snatch it away. Instead, she adds another to her basket. "Better grab them while they're still warm from the sun," she says to no one in particular. You smile. You're not sure when it became normal to overhear tomato advice on the street, but here we are. Later, at a library lecture, this time on the evolution of British taste, a well-meaning gentleman stands up and asks whether there are any foods left that remain too scandalous for the English table. The speaker, a small man with spectacles and a bow tie that refuses to sit straight, pauses for a moment before answering. Once, he says, "We feared the tomato. We blamed it for everything from indigestion to impulsive behaviour. But now it's just a fruit, a red thing you slice. And in that, perhaps, is the lesson. What we fear today, we may snack on tomorrow." The audience chuckles. You scribble the line into your journal. "We may snack on tomorrow." It's a nice thought. On your walk home, you pass a row of narrow houses, each with a window box. Most have geraniums, a few have herbs, and there, nestled among mint and basil, are tomatoes. Small cherry-sized ones, glowing orange-red in the late afternoon sun. No signs, no warnings, just there. A few doors down, you're waved over by an old friend, Mrs. Bellamy, the retired schoolteacher who once warned you that tomatoes were culinary mischief, wrapped in deceitful colour. She now offers you a slice of tomato tart with such casualness it nearly knocks you off balance. "It's the vinegar," she says, "cuts through the sweetness, learned that from a recipe sent by my niece in Brighton." You take a bite, perfect crust, a little thyme, a faint hum of garlic. She watches your face, and when you smile, she laughs. "I hated them once," she admits. "Couldn't stand the smell, thought they were slimy. But now, well, I suppose my tongue grew up." She pauses. "Or maybe," she says softly, "I stopped letting other people decide what I liked." There it is again. The core of the matter, not flavour, not classification, permission. You think of all the moments along the way, your first taste at Lord Barrington's, the stern warning from Dr. Thistlecroft, the tomato stew in the tavern, the secret garden party, the trembling spoon at the Weatherstones. Each one a step on a winding, vine-like path toward acceptance. Back home you light a candle, pull your chair up to the window and sit with your notebook. The night has settled in, cool and comfortable. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks once, then goes silent. The windows are mostly dark now, except for one across the street where someone's still cooking. You can smell it, onions, herbs, and yes, unmistakably, tomatoes simmering gently on the stove. Not long ago, that would have seemed exotic. Now, it just smells like dinner. You close your notebook, place it beside the latest recipe card you've collected, this one for tomato jam with nutmeg, and you feel, for a moment, quietly proud. Not because you changed the world, but because you watched it tilt. A few degrees, a few meals, a few brave bites at a time. It's early evening when you find yourself standing in front of an unfamiliar iron gate, holding a folded note that simply reads, Thursday, just follow the lanterns. You weren't sure you'd come. It felt final somehow. Like the last chapter in a book you've been stretching out, not ready for the end. But here you are, drawn by something more than curiosity, something closer to gratitude. The gate creaks open, revealing a narrow path lit by hanging lanterns. They sway gently in the breeze, casting golden puddles of light across the gravel. The air is rich with late summer scents, basil, damp earth, smoke, and something sweet and slow roasting in the distance. You follow the path into what must once have been a manor garden, though now it feels more like a gathering place for half the town. There's laughter, someone strumming a guitar, and the long tables are already filling with dishes, most of them. Red. Tonight is a harvest dinner. You weren't told it was about tomatoes. You didn't need to be. You're handed a plate by a boy with a crooked grin who says, We've got them baked, grilled, pickled, mashed, dried, and candied. Even a tomato brulee, if you can believe it. You believe it. You've learned to believe a lot of things lately. As you make your way through the garden, you recognize faces. Some familiar, Lady Clarissa, laughing as she tries to spear a roasted tomato with a too dainty fork. The baker who once hid her tomato tarts behind the sponge cakes, now proudly handing them out with dollops of creme fraiche. Dr. Thistlecroft. Dr. Thistlecroft, cautiously sipping from a cup of tomato consommé, eyebrows furrowed, not in disapproval, but concentration. You take a seat near the fire pit, where a pot bubbles lazily and the night buzzes with contentment. Someone offers you a slice of tomato and caramelized onion galette. Another shares pickled green tomatoes wrapped in cheesecloth like precious relics. You eat, you listen. You let yourself simply be. You feel. Eventually someone stands and taps a spoon against a glass. It's the playwright, the same one who hosted the Red Dinner. He holds up his drink, something fizzy and herbal, and raises an eyebrow with theatrical flair. I propose a toast, he says, not to revolution or to vindication, but to the humble tomato, who endured our fear, our slander, and our suspicion only to feed us anyway. Laughter. He continues, to the fruit that made us rethink what we thought we knew, and to all of you who tasted something scary and kept chewing. Glasses clink, the night softens into music, and you watch people dance beneath strings of lights. Young couples, old friends, children darting between legs with tomato-stained fingers. There's no ceremony to it, no grand announcement, just people enjoying something that once needed defending. You wander toward the edge of the garden, where tomato vines climb wooden trellises like curious spirits. A woman in her 80s gently ties a branch to a post and hums a song older than any recipe you've read. She notices you and gestures to a ripe tomato dangling nearby. "They like to be picked at dusk," she says. "Sweeter then." You reach up and twist the fruit gently from the vine. It's warm in your palm, familiar. She watches you, then says, "Funny thing, my mother wouldn't let one near the kitchen. Said they'd curse the soup. I grow 30 plants now. Don't tell her." "I should I?" You smile. "Your secret's safe with me." She pats your arm. "They always said we feared the tomato because it was foreign. But truth is, we feared it because it was new. New things remind us we're still changing, and that's uncomfortable." You nod. Then she adds with a wink, "But also, let's be honest, people just didn't know how to cook it." That makes you laugh. Because it's true. Fear often blooms where understanding hasn't yet been planted. As you walk back toward the heart of the garden, you notice something small. A child sitting cross-legged, sketching by candlelight. You peer over his shoulder and see it, a tomato carefully drawn in soft pencil. Not a monster, not a mystery, just a fruit. The child looks up. "I like their shape," he says. "They look like they're always about to smile." You ruffle his hair gently and move on, past the tables, the dancing, the quiet joy settling into every corner like dusk itself. And as the stars blink awake above the treetops, you feel something lift. Not just the end of suspicion or the acceptance of a fruit, but a quiet celebration of change itself, the kind that happens one bite at a time. You wake the next morning to the smell of something simmering. Not in your home, you haven't even lit the stove yet, but somewhere nearby, maybe through an open window or drifting in from the flat downstairs. It's unmistakable: garlic, onions, maybe a touch of thyme, and tomatoes. Slow-cooked, sun-ripened, and now entirely uncontroversial. You sit with that thought for a while, stirring your tea slowly. Not long ago, this scent would have caused a stir, raised eyebrows, gossip, dire warnings from dinner guests who read an article about that once. Now it's just breakfast in someone else's flat. Just Tuesday. That evening, you're invited to a small dinner at the home of a man you met during one of the early tomato debates, Mr. Edwin Marsh. Once a proud anti-tomato campaigner, known for his insistence that red belongs in currants, not cutlery, he now hosts monthly experimental evenings. Come hungry, the invitation reads, and possibly forgiving. You arrive at dusk. His dining room has been rearranged since you were last there. More plants, more cookbooks, less mahogany. The table is long, communal, dotted with jars of homemade chutney and a large bowl of something glossy and orange. "Tomato aspic," he says proudly, setting it down like a crown roast. "But improved. This one doesn't wobble like despair." He laughs. So do you. Around the table sit a cast of familiar types. A former skeptic, now a hobby gardener. A young woman who once wrote an article called "The Acid Within," but now runs a recipe column titled "Sauced and Satisfied." There's even a reverend who admits he's added tomatoes to the church picnic quiche. In moderation, of course. Dinner is hearty and informal. There's tomato bread with salted butter, tomato and lentil stew, a tomato glaze on roasted pork, and a tomato tart with goat cheese and caramelized shallots that nearly brings a tear to someone's eye. Halfway through the meal, someone raises their glass and says, "To the fruit that taught us patience," you add, "and to the people who needed a second bite." Laughter, glasses clink. Later, as dessert arrives, tomato jam thumbprint cookies, surprisingly good. The conversation drifts to how other ingredients have made similar journeys. "Asparagus used to be scandalous," someone says. Garlic was only for foreigners, adds another. Even tea, the Reverend declares, once thought to make women too clever. A general chuckle rolls through the room. It strikes you then that the tomato never wanted any of this. It didn't ask to be feared or worshipped, to be political or poetic. It simply existed, ripe and ready, waiting for someone brave enough to bite. And isn't that how most change begins? Not in proclamations or protests, but in quiet repetition. In seeds tucked into garden beds, in pies shared without warning, in sauces that start as whispers and end in second helpings. After dinner, you step into the garden with a few guests. The night is mild and someone has strung fairy lights along the trellis where tomato vines still cling, though the season is waning. The fruits are fewer now, some green, some going soft, but they hang there with the contentment of a long summer well spent. Mr. Marsh joins you, holding a small notebook. I've started writing it all down, he says. Recipes, stories, little things people have said. Thought I'd call it the Red Journal. You ask why? He shrugs. Because it wasn't just food, was it? It was belief, doubt, shame, hope. I think we owe it to the tomato to remember what we put it through. You nod. And what it gave us in return. He tears a tomato from the vine, one of the last, and hands it to you. It's still warm, its skin slightly cracked from age, but no less beautiful. Take it, he says, a little souvenir from the war. You cradle it in your hand all the way home. No need to wrap it. No need to hide it, just you and the tomato, walking down the lamplit street like old friends who no longer need to explain anything. Because everyone understands now. You wake the next morning to soft rain tapping at the window, the kind that seems more intent on storytelling than soaking anything through. The tomato from last night still sits on your kitchen table, where you placed it without ceremony, a quiet guest waiting patiently. You slice it at breakfast. There's no hesitation, no reflection, no nod to history. Just the familiar glide of the knife through tender flesh, the sprinkle of salt, the first bite. It's sweet and earthy, like rain-soaked summer, and it's gone in 3 more chews. The fact that you didn't think about it as anything but food is, perhaps, the final proof. The tomato has arrived, not with fanfare or revolution, but with normalcy. And so you find yourself spending the day walking. The rain lets up by mid-morning, replaced by that misty dampness that settles into everything but also softens the world around you. Shopkeepers stand outside with tea mugs. A child in a yellow cloak stomps through puddles with the righteous joy of a conqueror. You stop by the grocer's just to see. The tomatoes aren't hidden anymore. They're front and centre, stacked in baskets nestled among peppers and onions. There's even a small handwritten sign. Ask about our new Sicilian varieties. You do. And the grocer's apprentice launches into a passionate explanation about soil pH, sun exposure, and which ones are best for roasting. He's about 17. You're fairly certain he hasn't not loved tomatoes in his life. That's the future, you think. Not the lectures or the debates or hesitations, but the next generation, who only know tomatoes as a certainty. Not a threat, not a risk, just something that goes well with cheese and a little olive oil. You wander next into a bookshop, one you haven't visited in some time. There, on the front table, is a new release. From Forbidden to Familiar, the story of the tomato in England. The cover shows a tomato on a silver spoon, dramatic lighting, slight sepia tint. You flip through, it's all there. Pewter poisoning, the mad fruit pamphlets, the great tomato trials, the underground recipes, the satirical poetry, the chutneys. Your favourite? A small reprinted cartoon showing a tomato in a courtroom dock, wearing spectacles and looking unbothered. The last chapter is called The Fruit That Waited. You purchase it naturally. That evening you receive a small envelope in the post, sealed in wax. No return address, just a card inside. On the front, a watercolour of a tomato vine climbing a wrought iron fence. Inside, in looping script, dinner this Friday, casual, red encouraged. A friend from the garden. You smile. You already know who it's from. You set the card down and make a note in your calendar. Tomato dinner, wear something you won't mind staining. Later that night, as the wind picks up and the air smells like wet stone and distant fireplaces, you sit by the window with a small plate of tomato and goat cheese tart, left over from a neighbour who accidentally made too many. You eat slowly, savouring every bite, not because it's rare, but because it's yours. You remember when tasting a tomato felt like crossing a line. Now it feels like coming home. It's Friday evening now, and the air is thick with the last warmth of the season, a gentle farewell from summer as it edges toward fall. The sky is bruised with lavender and gold, and you walk slowly through streets you've come to know like the folds of a well-worn book. You're headed to the garden again. Not the wild, lantern-lit one from months ago, but a smaller space now. A back courtyard tucked behind a row of modest townhomes, half paved with stones, half covered in trailing vines and broken flower pots. You push open the gate and step into the scent of roasting vegetables, citrus, and wood smoke. Laughter drifts on the breeze. Someone's already started playing music, a soft, lilting tune on a violin, accompanied by the low clink of glasses and the rustle of napkins. The table is long, mismatched, charming. Candles flicker in old jars. At its centre, bowls of tomato dishes stretch like a painted tapestry. Roasted cherry tomatoes with thyme, a spiced tomato compote with dates and cinnamon, a rustic tart with leeks and aged cheese. You recognise almost everyone. The baker, the gardener, the former skeptic with the carefully oiled moustache, the poet who once swore tomatoes were a ruse of the devil. Even Dr. Thistlecroft is here, carefully chewing a slice of marinated tomato and looking, if not joyful, at least deeply conflicted and satisfied. You take your seat and pass the bread. No one mentions the history tonight. No one raises a toast to the journey. That chapter, it seems, has closed, not with ceremony, but with acceptance. And yet, before dessert is served, someone lifts a glass anyway. To the tomato, she says softly. No grand applause, just a few nods, a quiet smile. You eat. You laugh. You stay until the candles are pools of wax and the air grows cool enough to warrant pulling your coat close. And when you finally leave, someone hands you a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Seeds, they whisper, for next year. You nod, tuck them into your pocket, and make your way home, beneath a velvet sky dusted with stars. Do-hyung. The streets are empty now. Your shoes tap gently against cobblestones, the rhythm steady and familiar. Windows glow like watchful eyes, but the world feels hushed, like it's holding its breath for something kind. You climb the steps to your door, the key cold in your hand. Inside, the fire crackles softly, its orange light flickering across walls that now feel warmer than before. You change into something soft, set the bundle of seeds on the mantel, and pour a small glass of something sweet. Then you sit by the window one last time. The city is sleeping, or trying to. Even the air seems to sigh. You rest your chin in your palm, gaze out across the rooftops, and think of vines curling over fences, of tables passed down through generations, of laughter over sauces that once stirred fear. You think of tomatoes, once forbidden, now forgotten in their scandal, cherished only for their taste. You smile. And as the fire settles into a low glow and the clock ticks its sleepy rhythm, your eyes grow heavy, the candle burns low. The pages of your book slip shut. The night holds you gently. The world, strange and soft and always changing, keeps turning. And in 100 kitchens across the city, tomatoes simmer quietly in the dark. End of script. Sweet dreams. Sweet,